And now, Daljit Dhaliwal.
With the new administration, the focus of U.S. interests in the Middle East seems to have shifted from Iraq to stabilization of Afghanistan. But periodic suicide bombings in Baghdad and elsewhere remind us that while we may have moved on, the ethnic and religious struggles in Iraq continue. Our next guest has recently returned from the region under the auspices of the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. It is a pleasure to welcome Nir Rosen back to the program. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
So you just got back from Afghanistan, where elections have taken place, two mixed reviews. I mean, tell us a little bit more about the purpose of your trip and where did your travels take you?
I focused on Helmand province in the south, which is the worst province in terms of daily security and violence, and of course drug production. It's been a terrible month for the British over there, the month of July when I was there. And I was focusing on the Afghan police over there and the Americans who are training them. And the key from President Obama's point of view, the key exit strategy is to transition Afghanistan over to Afghan security forces. So if they're going to win this counterinsurgency battle, they're going to have to train an effective police force, which so far they've failed to do. In fact, the police are among the causes for people to support the Taliban. And the police are the face of the government for most Afghans. That's all they see. And they see police being corrupt and stealing from them, doing drugs. So this is their view of the government, and the Taliban offer at least some kind of justice and a system with integrity, even if it's a bit harsh. Life is deteriorating for citizens in much of Afghanistan. The Taliban are active in half the country, and they control a very large part of the country. All the main roads in much of the country are very vulnerable to Taliban or are in their hands. The police that I saw, many didn't even speak the local language. Many of them were Tajiks. They spoke Dari. In the south, they speak Pashto. The police couldn't even communicate with people. There were many incidents of, I would say at least half of the police were doing drugs, the marijuana or opium. They were being tested while I was there, so the results were coming in. Many didn't show up for the test, or they gave in water instead of urine samples, hoping they would fool the testers. They were stealing from civilians passing by. They weren't really engaging the Taliban. In fact, the Taliban were kind of this invisible ghost. They were there, they were operating at night, but the Americans had trouble finding them. They sort of just blended into the population. July was the initiation of sort of the first push of Obama's surge, or so-called surge in Afghanistan. Introduction of more troops, 8,000 Marines, from their point of view, try to clear and then hold. Clear areas of Taliban and then hold it and transition over to the Afghan security forces. But the Taliban very wisely just sort of melted away. They're going to wait it out. They know that if they engage the Americans or the British head on, of course they'll lose. So it's much wiser to sort of sink away, put their guns under their beds, and operate at night. Whatever the Americans achieve during the day, the Taliban can destroy at night by knocking on the guy's door and saying, if you cooperate with them, we're going to cut your head off. The Americans don't really patrol at night. The police sure don't, and the Taliban basically own the night. The purpose of America's presence in Afghanistan seems very ambiguous and undefined. If it's to get rid of Al-Qaeda, well, they're basically gone, and they're operating mostly out of Pakistan or out of the internet. If it's to get rid of the Taliban, then surely that's an over-ambitious goal. The Taliban have only been gaining in popularity, and in some ways they are representative of a significant part of the population, especially the Pashtun population, which is about 40% of the country. And American actions, killing civilians or just operating, even if they were operating in the absolute purest form, foreigners in the country eventually alienate the population, and surely in Afghanistan we've have plenty of evidence of that. And then the Afghan government itself, very ridden with corruption. One tribe benefits, another tribe loses. The losing tribe ends up joining the Taliban. Police abusing civilians, governors abusing, or district governors abusing civilians, pushes them into, out of protection for protection to the Taliban. Half an hour out of Kabul, you're in Taliban territory. And as we saw, much of that province in the elections just happened. Nobody could vote. They were too scared. In fact, these elections, I would say, were in many ways a victory for the Taliban. People might have been expecting more violence, but the Taliban actually, I think, benefited by letting elections happen and letting people see the high levels of fraud and corruption and lack of legitimacy these elections are already appearing to have by reports we're getting from much of the country. They further delegitimize the government and the international community. So the Taliban can just sit there and actually let them happen and show the people the extent to which the government is corrupt, to which the international community doesn't even care. I mean, the international community applauded these elections as a success, whereas throughout Afghanistan we were getting stories about massive ballot stuffing and fraud, very low turnouts in much of the country, and yet high numbers being reported at the same time for areas where we know almost nobody turned out. The Taliban also managed to prevent voting in much of the country just by threatening people.
So really then, I mean, this election has happened. To what extent is the ordinary Afghan citizen politically engaged? Do they think that their vote is going to make a difference? Do they even believe that going out to vote is an important exercise in democracy?
Well, we saw from the low turnout, even in relatively safe areas, that there was a lot of apathy and cynicism. And to the extent that people are politically engaged, I think, and thought for some naive reason that this would make a difference, I think they've been very disappointed.
Did you notice, did you come across any instances where you felt optimistic when it came to the development of human rights or women's issues?
Well, this is a government, that's a good example. This is a government which just basically legalized raping your wife. And if she refuses, then you can starve her. This is a government that the Americans are backing, a government which supports the implementation of laws like this, for whatever reason. I can't imagine what would justify it. A government that imprisons journalists for life. A government in many ways that differs very little from the Taliban government, except that it's far more corrupt. Of course, there are more schools open here and there. Kabul has parts that are thriving. In part, these areas are thriving thanks to drug money and corruption. But there is a thriving business atmosphere in Kabul and here and there elsewhere. It's not all bleak, but in general, it is quite bleak. This is a government that I don't think anybody who cares about women's rights would want to support. And of course, the women's movement was one of the primary actors in pushing for the war in Afghanistan and for the overthrow of the Taliban. So I think they too have been betrayed by the end result, as have, of course, Afghan women.
What are your thoughts on that? Do you think it is a mission of necessity still?
I don't know if it ever was a mission of necessity. I mean, it wasn't the Taliban who attacked the U.S. in September 11, it was Al-Qaeda. And it is an important distinction. Mullah Omar didn't actually know about the September 11 attacks. Now, no American president, I think, could politically survive if he hadn't invaded Afghanistan. And once you do that to overthrow Al-Qaeda, I guess you're sort of stuck with it. But it's hard to justify from an American strategic point of view why you would be there. From a humanitarian point of view, there's a million reasons why. These are desperate people who've been betrayed and abused by their leaders, by the Soviets, by the Americans. I mean, our relationship with Afghanistan didn't begin in 2001.